Welcome to this course on Secondary Data Review and Analysis from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Introduction. The objective of this course is to strengthen national societies' ability to review secondary data using the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies analysis framework to inform strategic and programmatic decision-making in support of its operations. The course consists of 4 video tutorials where we will discuss different topics. The first lesson will cover some key principles we need to consider in a needs assessment process. In the second lesson, we will discuss humanitarian needs analysis and the steps to take to do humanitarian needs analysis. In the third lesson, we will talk more about humanitarian needs analysis by looking at analysis frameworks and how we do secondary data review. Lastly, we will go over DEEP, an online platform that supports secondary data review. You can watch the videos separately from each other, but we recommend going from the first to the last video in that order. Where possible, we have some online exercises and homework to help learning and understanding. Lesson 1. Introduction to Needs Assessment. In the first lesson, we will talk about needs assessments, what they are, why we do them, and what the process is for doing an assessment. After this lesson, anyone who watched this video should be able to describe the basic principles of humanitarian needs assessment. Needs assessment. Let's start with some basic definitions. We define needs assessment as how organizations identify and measure the humanitarian needs of a disaster-affected community. Simply put, needs assessment is the best way to answer the question, what assistance do disaster-affected communities need? In assessments, we have to make the best use of what we have. The balance between time, quality and resources makes us rely just as much on secondary data as primary data. Primary and secondary data combined will usually give us the best picture available at a certain point in time. Operational context. The aim of an assessment is to help understand a humanitarian situation by identifying the main problems, why they happened and what their consequences are. The aim is therefore not to identify an intervention directly. Suggesting how to respond comes after the problems have been identified and the operational context has been taken into consideration. The operational context outlines humanitarian access to affected populations, the availability and quality of goods and services in local markets, and understanding of the capacity of international and national services and humanitarian providers, as well as other contextual information such as lessons learned, pipelines, etc. When you include the operational context in an assessment process, you can provide decision makers with an analytical output that can really inform response strategy, program design, system improvement, and allocation of resources. Know what you need to know. Regardless of what kind of emergency or what context you are in, we need to start by asking ourselves some basic questions. What decisions need to be made? Who will make them? What information is needed to make the decisions? The answers to these questions will create a framework for organizing an assessment and clarify your objectives. Assessments aim to identify. In many sudden onset emergencies, however, the objectives of an assessment are not that different from one disaster to the next. They should contribute to the overall common operational picture, focusing on identifying scope, how large, and scale, how many, of the crisis, most affected geographic areas, most affected population groups, most affected sectors, priority needs by humanitarian sector and intersector, i.e. combined needs, drivers, In other words, the underlying factors or root causes that are driving a crisis and its most acute problems or possible chain of events forward. Response and capacities. Vulnerabilities and risks. Operational constraints. Assessment process. There is a process to undertaking emergency needs assessments. On the right, I will outline the process, which is continuous, and name activities in the steps. On the left, you will see some outputs from each step. The description of the steps and products has been slightly shortened for the purposes of this slide. There are several concepts we will name in this slide, such as secondary data review, analysis frameworks, or needs analysis. We will briefly mention them here in the assessment process, but we'll talk about these in more detail in the upcoming lessons. The first step is to contextualize and adapt. What we mean by this is that we have to start looking at what it is we want to do and want to know. What do we have already? What assessments are already out there that we can draw on? What other secondary data can we find? We look at everything we have, everything that is missing, and that way start mapping out what we need to do and establish our baseline. Revise known information and information gaps. Then we design and plan our assessment. We set the objectives and scope of our assessment. We continue working on a secondary data review so that we can review what we have and what is missing, thus what we need to collect. We finalise our analysis framework where we map out what information it is that we need. We adapt our analysis plan, how we are going to analyse the data we are planning to collect. We make a plan for how we are going to do our assessment, what our methodology will be, the output, etc. We also design what the assessment team will look like. The third step is to execute our plan. In other words, collect our data. This means that we have identified where we are going to do our data collection, trained our data collection teams, checked the quality control of incoming data, stored our primary data, continued collecting secondary data. Once we have completed our data collection, we can start analysing our data. We can start summarising and comparing primary data, interpret what it means, and state our assumptions. In doing analysis, we can determine the current needs, how severe they are, and define our priorities. In the final step, we share and evaluate our findings. This means we share tangible products and have a dissemination strategy. We also collect feedback and see where we need to revise our assessment process, our tools, etc., and how we can improve our analysis. From situation analysis to monitoring. To better illustrate this, let's look at this simple model describing the humanitarian program cycle. We first have our situation analysis, coming out of our initial data collection and our operational context. Ideally, this analysis will help us determine needs, severity, priorities, etc. Once we have a clear overview of what's needed and the operational environment, decision makers can start analysing the response. What should be the objectives? Who are the target groups? What options do we have to respond? And also, based on the operational environment, what is actually feasible in terms of response? We then plan for our response by determining what the target criteria should be, how long we intervene, how often, etc. Then a response is executed, so we actually implement what we plan. When we are implementing, we also monitor and evaluate the implementation. Is it effective? Are we reducing need? Are we reaching the people initially targeted? This should give us a revised needs analysis, and the cycle continues. Across the entire cycle, data is essential to design appropriate and proportionate response. Without data, most of our interventions are wrong or do not reach the most in need. In essence, we collect data because we need to inform, not because it is nice to know. Make sense, not data. We have mentioned analysis a few times, but let us dive a bit deeper into what we actually mean by this. Think of analysis as a weather app on your phone. The weather app will give you a lot of data, temperature and precipitation at different times of the day, light, UV index, etc. But basically, at the end of the day, it tells you that it's raining now. Describing the data is not enough to be considered a good analysis, and there is still a way to go before we can make sense of the information. Unfortunately, too many assessment products nowadays mix data and reports together without further explanation and leave all interpretation to the reader. Assessments need to be an explanatory and not just a descriptive summary of what the problems are. An explanation is needed as to why the problems are as they are, and possible consequences need to be highlighted. So, if you have to interpret the data provided by your weather app and what the data means, the main message should be, get your umbrella. One should seek to analyse more and report less. Simply collecting information, repackaging it and passing it on is not good enough. More information does not mean just being better informed. You need to interpret what the data means, as opposed to just summarising facts and figures. Rather approximately right than precisely wrong. Of course, we face many constraints in assessments in humanitarian settings. Assessments in emergency come with caveats, and uncertainty is more the rule than the exception. Proper analysis takes time, but taking time is a luxury one cannot afford in a crisis. It may be accurate and precise, but late. When human lives are at stake, decisions need to be made quickly, but a minimum of information will still be needed before deciding where to go. Basing important decisions on biased assumptions and opinions without any facts or evidence to back them up is dangerous even at the best of times. Making timely analysis with caveats is far better than no analysis at all. It may be less precise, but still more accurate. Instead of aiming for precision too early in the response, settle for accuracy and design a process that is good enough to allow timely decisions to be made. Being good enough means choosing an achievable solution, most likely a simple rather than a complicated one. In emergency response, a quick and simple approach to needs assessment may be the only practical possibility. Precision and accuracy increase over time. As we saw earlier, assessments are not isolated events. We build the next assessment on the previous one, and the precision and accuracy of the information collected increases over time. In the first initial phase, data collection is quick and dirty, and we explore what has happened. The next phase is more targeted. Sites are deliberately selected, and we try to obtain information about the impact of the crisis and to generate explanations as to why the impact is greater here as opposed to there. Later, assessments become more comprehensive. We use more representative techniques to obtain more precise information and confirm hypotheses or explanations generated in earlier assessment. More detail over time. Another thing that changes over time is the depth of information. Time constraints in the early days following a crisis situation limit your options. Think of it as using the zoom of your camera. You start with a wide zoom, but have to zoom in more closely to a subject over time, increasing the focus and level of detail. To begin with, the focus is at the community level, a more zoomed out point of view. Following this, you focus more at a group level, identified during the previous assessment. You can focus on specific groups, such as the internally displaced. Later, you can go more in depth into issues and focus on the household level. With more time and resources, you could even go zoom in fully and go down to the individual level. The key point here is that the results of each phase provide more detail as time goes on and inform the design of the next assessment. More participation over time. Similarly to zooming in on different levels, the time frame available will have an effect on the data collection method. Conclusions and explanations early on will mostly be based on a few field visits, key informant interviews and direct observation, which are compared to the results of secondary data review. These data collection techniques are mostly based on expert judgment and the use of experienced staff. Assessment cells can, however, also use community group discussions, which are a more participatory-based approach to data collection and applicable even for rapid assessments. Later on, when more time and resources are available, data collection techniques can be used that focus more on the voice of the affected population, such as focus group discussion, household interviews, individual surveys, etc. Two data collection families can be identified. Those that can be used during initial and rapid assessment but are more based on expert judgments, and those that can be used with more time and resources and enable the affected population to have a greater voice. Change in focus over time. We also see that focus of assessment changes over time. During the first assessments, the focus is on saving and sustaining lives and obtaining an understanding about the access to basic services and goods. However, very quickly there is also a need to understand how livelihoods have been disrupted and to start identifying the basis for early recovery. This multiple focus is required to inform overlapping emergency program phases. The truth is that it is not always possible to inform all emergency response phases to the same level. There must be prioritization. Coordinated assessments. Let's talk a bit about coordination of assessments and what we mean by that. A coordinated assessment is an assessment planned and carried out by humanitarian actors in partnership in order to document the impact of a particular crisis and identify the needs of affected populations. The results of this assortment are shared with the broader humanitarian community. The term coordinated assessments includes both joint and harmonized assessments. Uncoordinated assessments happen when organizations are undertaking assessments separately, meaning that data sets are not interoperable and the results cannot be used to inform the overall analysis. It is nearly impossible to provide an overview of needs based on uncoordinated assessments, especially at the beginning of an emergency if assessment reports are not shared or not well documented regarding their location, methods and data. This type of assessment only serves the organisation who made them and leads to other organisations doing their own assessments, often in the same place, risking assessment fatigue in an affected population who end up receiving more assessment teams than actual relief. In harmonised assessments, data collection, processing and analysis is still undertaken separately, but the data is sufficiently comparable. Due to a minimum level of collaborative planning, the use of common operational data sets and key indicators, the results can be compiled into a single database and subject to shared analysis. This type of assessment will ensure both an organisation's wish for independence in data collection, analysis, program planning and resources allocation, while also contributing to a coordinated humanitarian relief operation. A joint assessment is when you plan, design and implement an assessment together with other organisations using the same tools, the same database, jointly analyse the same findings and publish a joint report. These are often multi-sectoral and used in the early days of an emergency when time is short and there is a need to quickly inform life-saving response. The assessment cell. There are many ways of structuring a team tasked with assessing humanitarian needs. Within IFRC, we refer to it as an assessment cell. This visual shows one way the cell can be organised, where you divide it into secondary data collection, primary data collection, and humanitarian information analysts who work on managing all the information that flows through the cell. Regardless of what adaptations to this structure you choose, it's imperative to include remote support in the assessment cell. With the amount of data that needs to be collected and processed, it will be too much for staff sitting in the field, and you should utilise the possibility of having team members located at HQ or another place with reliable, high-speed internet and sufficient server capacity who can take on a variety of tasks. Secondary data collection is often a task that is well suited for remotely located staff, as they can access a vast number of data sources and bring the data together in one database that the field-based staff can also access. The importance of analysis. Previously, we described the assessment process, showing you a cycle of activities. Please remember that just collecting data is not enough, and you also need to analyse the data properly. We should always strive to turn data into information and information into insight. In doing analysis, we determine the current needs, how severe they are, and define our priorities. In the next video, we will look closely at humanitarian needs analysis and what the steps to doing analysis actually entail. Conclusion. To conclude our first session, we want to reiterate the following things. Assessments aim to inform humanitarian decision-making. Make sense, not data. The assessment process changes over time. Secondary data review and analysis are key to the assessment process.